birth, made in a way that's the sons of smile.
Welcome to the second episode of our exploration of Laudato Si, the papal encyclical about the environmental crisis. In the last episode, we looked at the first chapter of Laudato Si, what is happening to our common home. Consulting the best scientists in the world, Pope Francis identified a number of ecological challenges facing humanity and creation. Dr. Philip Sakamoto, an astrophysicist and former NASA scientist and prominent environmentalist, Peter Preble, examined various global environmental issues using scientific data and observations. We also discovered that in Laudato Si, Pope Francis clearly states that we are now witnesses to a single but complex socio-environmental crisis. He criticizes those who ignore the problems of climate change and particularly its effects on the poor. The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor is a single cry, especially in developing countries, because human environment and natural environment deteriorate together. In this episode, we shall be looking at Chapter 2, the Gospel of Creation, and Chapter 3, the human roots of the ecological crisis. We shall look at the wisdom of the biblical accounts, particularly the meaning of Genesis 2:15, to till and to keep, and how this is applied to our farming communities in Saskatchewan. We shall explore how God's creatures have their own value, completely independent of us and our need for them. We shall end part 2 by looking at the very important concept of Anthropocene and the implications for life on this planet. The encyclical encourages us to look at the foundation of our beliefs, drawing on both scripture and tradition to help the Christian community make significant contributions in caring for our home. Religions evolve in response to the changing spiritual experiences of the faithful within different cultures and to the continued reinterpretation of sacred texts. Recognizing this particular historical and cultural moment, Pope Francis reinterprets humanity's privilege, dominion, and control over God's creatures. Emphasizing instead on our interrelatedness and the relationship of love between the Creator and His creations, he reminds us of our obligation to exercise responsible stewardship and coexist with all of creation. This deep universal communion is to be extended to all living beings. Love, respect, justice, and compassion are to be shown to those who are weakest amongst us. Pope Francis includes the New Zealand bishops who have asked what the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," means when 20% of the world's population consumes resources at a rate that robs the poor nations and the future generations of what they need to survive. Pope Francis challenges us when he states that we must respect all living beings. We have only one heart, and the same wretchedness which leads us to mistreat an animal will not be long in showing itself in our relationship with other people. Every act of cruelty towards any creature is contrary to our human dignity. In Chapter 2, the Gospel of Creation, Pope Francis reaffirms that creation is not only good, but is also good news. The physical world has been made out of an act of love on the part of God. Creation is God's love story to humanity. He states, "The universe did not emerge as a result of arbitrary omnipotence, a show of force, or a desire of self-assertion. Creation is of the order of love. God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things." Pope Francis continues in a poetic way. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, His boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. This loving God calls humanity to till and to keep the garden of this world. And as the Pope explains, tilling refers to cultivating, plowing, or working, while keeping means caring, protecting, overseeing, and preserving. In other words, human activity is to promote the land's ability to grow plants for the long term. Let's take a look at an example of farmers in Saskatchewan who are trying to live out this reality.
My name is Darren Qualman. I'm here on our farm by Dunder in Saskatchewan. I've, for a big part of my life, been Director of Research at the National Farmers Union. I'm now doing work with them on climate change and agriculture, and just finishing up a book on civilizations and energy. When we're standing in front of our barn, it wasn't made for dairy cattle or cattle of any kind. It was built to house draft horses, so the pulling power for the farm. I guess the irony is it was finished in 1918, just at the time that horses were replaced by tractors. And we began a 100-year process, 100 years so far, of injecting more and more fossil fuels into agriculture. I'm certainly not trying to give the impression that farming is bad. Farming is the food production system that we have does a lot of things right. But like every part of our economy and society, over the last 100 years, it has been transformed into something that is highly fossil fuel dependent. Huge amounts of energy and material has to go into food production. And in the food system as a whole, it takes about 13.3 calories, mostly from fossil fuels, to make every calorie that we eat. Fertilizers like nitrogen are really a fossil fuel product. If you go to a nitrogen fertilizer factory, there's a big natural gas pipe coming in one side and a big hydrous ammonia nitrogen pipe coming out the other side. So we're really turning fossil fuels into fertilizer, into food, into people. And those inputs we're putting in are also very costly. If you look at net farm income, you see that gross revenue goes up very quickly, but net income kind of stays flat. And that's because the people that sell the inputs are taking more and more and more in the middle. If we could reduce input use, we would simultaneously reduce emissions, but we also have a really good chance of increasing net farm income. So the core of a solution, I think, is low input agriculture. Low input agriculture has the potential to be high net income and low emission.
Bit of moisture there, good. Spring wheat, it's a good crop. It's just pretty resilient. You know, it's a bit drought tolerant and weed competitive. It's fairly easy to grow. So it's nice. It's a nice crop and one of the staples on organic farms. My name's Ian Cushion. I'm an organic farmer near Oxbow, Saskatchewan. I have been organic farming since 1985. I grew up on this farm. My grandparents settled here in the early 1920s, and my father and mother farmed here and raised 5 children. We farm 4,400 cultivated acres, all organic. Our entire farm is almost 6,000 acres. Our cultivated acres are typically cropped to wheat, oats, peas, lentils, hemp. We have a lot of alfalfa seed. We grow a lot of green manure crops on our farm to improve the soil and protect the soil.
We continue to try to learn and develop our understanding and our relationship with how we're farming and what works and what doesn't work, and improve on our practices.
What we've seen in the last 30 years is a lot more variability in the weather. We've seen a lot of record-setting weather events. I have no doubt that our growing season is longer and warmer than it has been, and there's no doubt that our climate has changed.
If you want to know about the land, if you want to know about the changes that are happening, you talk to somebody who's worked on the land, and they can put it in their own words, and they can tell you what they've seen. They're good observers, really good observers.
My father was a volunteer weather observer for Environment Canada since 1949, I think it is. And the trend line shows that temperatures warmed during that period.
I'm 101 plus 6 months, I guess. I got interested as a boy listening to my father. My father had a good knowledge of weather. I was interested in a rain gauge. I wrote the meteorological service and asked them about where I could get the official rain gauge, and they said they'd send it out. They sent that all out, and I kept the temperature in the morning and the precipitation during the day before. That is an indication that the climate is warming, and I've been saying that, and we better recognize it, because this country could be darn dry before we realize, and it's going to take rain to grow a crop.
There is a lot of resilience here in terms of the environment, but the one thing we need is moisture and fairly stable growing conditions as farmers. And if that becomes a challenge under climate change, then that will lead to some pretty severe consequences for farmers.
Climate's a pretty important subject. We better be aware of it, because there's ways of getting around it by using different methods.
If we're going to do anything about climate change, we're going to have to find a way to live our lives and to run our economies with much less fossil fuels. Agriculture is very dependent on use of fossil fuels, there's no doubt about that. In the 1950s, oil was discovered in this area, and it's become quite a significant oil-producing region. That actually is a well that my family owns the minerals for. It's one of the mineral wells that we have on our farm. It's a fairly big industry here. A lot of my friends and neighbors work in the oil industry. It's a significant source of income, and it would be hard to imagine what this area would look like without it.
You want to believe that you're immune from it and you're living in a bit of paradise, but we're not. We continue to drive. Transportation is a big issue in Saskatchewan. We're a big province. Things are spread out.
There's no question people gotta eat, they gotta pay the rent, they gotta pay the mortgage, and they're worried about their jobs and their incomes. Those are hugely valid concerns, so we shouldn't take that lightly, but we also have to think long term, and we have to think about, we only have one planet. You know, how long can we extract the resources and dump garbage on it and expect that it's going to do what it's supposed to do for us? Organic farmers have made some steps towards reducing our energy usage and reducing the impact on the environment. The most obvious thing is that we reduce off-farm input use of synthetic chemicals and fertilizers. Fundamentally, it's about designing a system that uses as much on-farm natural resources as possible, designing a crop rotation that accomplishes fertility, management, and pest control, and using a lot of diversity to build soils, to produce crops, and be productive.
It's critical to everybody. In fact, it's critical to the ones that's not farming, because work dries up.
I'd like to point out to my friends and family and neighbors that the value of what we receive from that well will be much smaller than the value of all the food crops that'll be produced on this land for hopefully the next several thousand years. So, the value of what's in the ground is important, but the value of soil and food production is going to be much, much more important in the long run.
In Laudato Si, Pope Francis departs from the once dominant view in the West of animals as useful and/or disposable, and instead inaugurates a new era in the Catholic Church's approach to the natural world. The world of animals, forests, mountains, and waters are inextricably bound to God's good news for us. They express and participate in the mystery of salvation. With that shift, Pope Francis aligns himself with ancient Christian teaching about the role of non-human creatures, a teaching that Eastern Christianity has retained. According to earlier writings dating well before the split between East and Western Christianity, animals have both emotion and intelligence. Both St. Gregory Nazianzen and St. Ephrem the Syrian viewed animals as sentient beings, using St. Paul's description of the one longing, one yearning that all things have for God in Romans 8:22-23 as evidence. St. Irenaeus, still highly regarded by both Eastern and Western churches, saw in animals profound mental intuition and perception. Likewise, St. Basil the Great articulated the following central themes: creaturely fellowship, based on the common origin from God of all creatures; opposition to injustice and all wrong; the recognition of the suffering of fellow creatures; and the rejection of a wholly instrumentalist view of animals in favor of the recognition that they also live for God. The patristic view of the animal world as a sensitive, instinctive reflection of God's loving act of creation was biblical. St. John saw all creatures participating in worship. The prophet Agur speaks of the wisdom of ants, badgers, locusts, and lizards. Job instructs his friends to seek truth. But ask the beasts, and they will teach you, the birds of the air, and they will tell you, or the plants of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. For all these writers, biblical and patristic, the non-human community has both instrumental value and inherent value. That holistic embrace of all creation has remained a strong component of Eastern Christianity, although Metropolitan John Zuzoulas admits that the strong negative influence of Platonic Gnostic dualism on the perception of the material world had entered the Church at an early point. However, Platonic dualism was much further developed in the West via Augustine and Boethius. Because of this, theologians and philosophers like Aquinas, Kant, and Descartes denied animals any intrinsic value, justice, or mercy, and importantly denied that animals had the capacity to feel pain. Thus, a strongly hierarchical view of creation, known as the chain of being, made it natural to see the non-human world as subordinate to humanity. The Genesis command to Adam and Eve to have dominion over nature became eventually what Pope Francis called a tyrannical anthropocentrism, unconcerned for other creatures. Pope Francis's clear call in Laudato Si to disassociate ourselves from an exploitive treatment of animals and irreverent attitude towards much of creation agrees with current teachings of Eastern Christianity based on the early Christian Church. St. Athanasius states that no part of creation is left void of him. He has filled all things everywhere. Metropolitan Callistus Ware wrote that animals are holy, and therefore the way we treat animals is directly relevant to our living a Christian life, because we have a pastoral responsibility towards the living creatures, domestic and wild, that God has given to us to be our companions. For the Eastern Church, the stewardship of the earth is an ultimate act of charity, obeying God's commandments in the Garden of Eden to till and to keep. As Ware explains, in the exercise of our dominion over the animals, we are to show the same gentleness and loving compassion that God Himself shows towards the whole of creation. Our pastoral responsibility begins with acknowledging that the natural world is the cosmic temple, in which non-humans and humans are equally called to be in prayerful and praiseful relationship with God. And an awareness of animals as not only our co-worshippers of God, but also as especially vulnerable, calls for compassion, and not only compassion. St. Isaac the Syrian reminds us, oppression is eradicated by compassion and renunciation. Renunciation, or asceticism, is a key component of the Eastern Church's way of life. This is not extreme asceticism, but rather living simply, focusing on needs, not wants. Whilst some actions may be lawful, they are not necessarily expedient. No time were we given permission to kill animals to indulge the passions and sins of greed or bloodlust. We are to treat animals with love, compassion, and mercy, both when they are living and if they have to be killed. Pope Francis would agree. Each community can take from the bounty of the earth whatever it needs for subsistence, but it also has the duty to protect the earth and to ensure its fruitfulness for coming generations. A balance that he calls a delicate equilibria among creatures. Early Christians, and then also Eastern Christians, had learned about the interconnectedness, delicate equilibria of all creatures from the reading of the Book of Nature. Even St. Aquinas saw the Book of Nature as revelatory. Pope Francis's references of the gospel of creation would sound quite familiar to the Eastern Church. According to St. John Climacus, nothing is without order or purpose in the animal kingdom. Each animal bears the wisdom of the Creator and testifies of Him. God granted man and animals many natural attributes, such as compassion, love, and feelings. As Pope Francis is aware, modern science is now also reading the Book of Nature and arriving at similar conclusions. Many species have language, intelligence, rational thought, self-awareness, creativity, use of tools, loving family units, and the capacity to feel physical pain and experience psychological suffering. Pope Francis thus seeks to revive in the Roman Catholic Church the same conviction that is at the heart of the Eastern Church's view of the animal kingdom. All created things, both human and non-human, make one congregation, one united body of worshipers seeking to glorify God. That calls for compassion, respect, and above all, reconciliation. Though some in the Christian community see climate change as a scientific problem, Pope Francis and the Eastern Church would disagree. Metropolitan Callistus Ware simply reminds all Christians this is not only Orthodox or Eastern Christian teaching, but part of a Christian heritage. Animals are part of God's creation, and we humans have a God-given responsibility towards creation. Then, at once, one sees that it is both a moral and spiritual question. In this episode, we shall be looking at Chapter 3, The Human Roots of the Ecological Crisis. Pope Francis acknowledges this time as the time of Anthropocene, the age of the human. Humans have now become a major planetary force and are indeed a force to be reckoned with. Edward O. Wilson, in his book Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, describes this epoch as the time in which the planet exists exclusively for and of ourselves. For the Pope, the root causes of the ecological challenges began with a conceptual problem, modern anthropocentrism. This is incredibly important because it indicates the fundamental force acting upon the earth at the present time is humanity. We are no longer biological agents making changes here and there on a small landscape. We are a geological agent changing the fundamental processes of the earth. We are changing the oceans. We are affecting climate change. We are affecting the physical earth. Not only is this unbelievably herbistic, it is incredibly dangerous. It leads to dislocation of persons, an increase in conflict, an increase in storms and droughts, enormous impact on poverty, health, and well-being. It is a cycle that needs to be reined in as urgently as possible.
Where wants to use you to meet others through you with words you don't know you can say. You might not know how the words that you sow are His gift today. God wants to use you to meet others through you with words you don't know you can say. You might not know how the words that you sow